Hello, this is John joining the call.
Yes, John, this is Rosemary.
Hi, Rosemary. How are you?
Fine, fine. We will wait for 10 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Rosemary. A quick question. How do I present? Do I send you the presentation over and you'll present it for me?
No, John, you can directly present it.
Um, oh, okay. I found the option. Okay, thank you.
Screen share.
Yeah.
എന്താ അത് കഴിഞ്ഞല്ലോ മറ്റത് കഴിഞ്ഞില്ല നടന്നില്ല തുടങ്ങാൻ പോലും
John, John, it is visible.
A warm good morning to all. With that, wholeheartedly welcome you all to the fourth day of online international faculty development program on recent trends and advancements in information technology. To handle today's enlightening session, we have with us Mr. John Umman, Security Analyst of Ernst Young, Kochi. His core domain is application security. He has more than 10 years of experience in the industry, during which he has been responsible for taking up the task of network and application security assessment for various organizations as well as for ENY. Currently focusing on vulnerability management of ENY, his expertise in the area is helping ENY to create processes and procedures to look after for complete lifecycle of vulnerabilities. On behalf of all of us, I welcome you, sir, for your enlightening session, and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm happy to be part of this faculty development program. And I hope there are some takeaways for every one of you from this presentation. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's visible.
Yes.
Okay, so about me, so as you heard, I'm an application network pen tester for within Ernst Young for almost 10 years. That is me on the left and my wife and 2-year-old. Um, we like this picture because we never knew this is going to be our last outing and our last movie, and we are really looking forward to day when all this COVID situation is gone away. So I started my career in information security with EY as an associate, and I have been to multiple roles in EY, from client-serving projects to internal information security projects. And currently, I am an assistant director, and I'm part of their vulnerability management team within information security. Um, so few disclaimers and things that I would like to let you know. So in the coming slides, you will see a different attack vectors listed out in each security domain. Please do not consider this as a complete list of attack vectors. There might be more attack vectors which are not that common and not included due to time constraints. Or there might be other attack vectors that I'm not familiar with as well. Right? So I'll be briefing about the popular ones that we still see out there. Um, We might not be able to go through each of them in very detail, but you'll get a brief understanding what it is, right? And also do not be discouraged if you do not understand any attack vector. I will add good links which you can refer at your convenience when I send this presentation out. So in the interest of time, you can put the questions that come up on top of your head in the chat, and we will discuss all those at the end of the presentation. And if the discussion needs to extend, we can correspond through emails or through any other collaboration tools that we have. So you have my contact information in the presentation. So please feel free to reach out to me in case of any queries or you wanted to discuss anything further. Okay. So what is there in for me in this presentation, right? So after this presentation, we'll have a good understanding of different possible attack vectors uh, that is that an attacker can exploit in an application. Um, some are old attack vectors, which are pretty much not existent today, but still we see them out there. And some are new as well, right? Which came into existence because of all these applications going to cloud infrastructure as well. Also, you will get a good understanding about how to prevent them from happening, and also what security controls you need to put in place to prevent them, right? And also you'll have a general awareness around certain things when you use an application and be mind and should be mindful about. Okay, so little bit of fundamentals of security. I'm quite sure that if you have learned about information security, you should be aware of CIA Triad, right? CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So whether it's an application, whatever you wanted to protect in an organization, right? So there are three places where you implement security if you consider an organization. That is people, process, and technology. So we'll be not talking about people and process, but on the technology aspect of things, right? So fundamentally, what CIA provides is a mental framework to assess where do you need to invest your limited resources to provide maximum security to what needs to be protected, right? So uh, all applications that are developed are not the same, right? Some application might need more security in protecting data confidentiality, right? And some needs more integrity to be inbuilt into it, like if you consider electronic voting systems and so, right? And if you consider the application that we are currently using right now, Google Meet, the availability is the utmost important thing for them, right? They need to make sure that the system is up and running so that we get this seamless interaction going on. So the takeaway here is that you need to understand what is more valuable for you to protect in an application and apply focus in those areas which need more, which are more important for you when you consider the overall application. So there are a lot of domains when you consider an application. When I say domains, areas where you need to focus and implement security measures or controls in place so that your application is protected, right? For me, so this is personal, right? So Different people will be saying they have 16, 17, 18. So for me, it's there are total of 15 domains or areas where you need to focus and build application, build security in an application, right? So with the interest of time, I will not be able to go through all these, but we'll be focusing on six of them, which are very interesting, and which has a lot of attack vectors associated with it. Right? And there are few that maybe we'll have a later on session and go through if you are interested to know more about. All right. So information leakage, right? Most of the times, this particular area is very underrated domain, right? When I say information leakage, it means information about an application itself exposed, right? For example, version details, debugging information, source code, right? All these uh, exposed to the exposed in the internet, so that the attacker can view this and design his attack plan according to that, right? So this usually aids an attacker to gather very useful information and insight about a system that he wanted to exploit, like as I mentioned, version details, technology information, etc. Oops, 1 second. So on the left, you'll see different attack vectors or sources of information leakage. And on the right, you will see the preventing measures. And there is a blue box down where I'll talk about few interesting topics and notes that I wanted to cover. Maybe it's in context of that domain or maybe out of context as well, right? So in the coming slides, I'll be following this structure so that you're not confused, right? Zero-day exploitation. So for those who are not familiar with zero-day, these are vulnerabilities uh, which the product owner has not released a patch for. Right. For example, say you are running your application server on Apache 2.2, and there is vulnerability that someone identified and released over internet, right? And the Apache Foundation, Software Foundation, has not fixed it, as they came to know about this vulnerability when it was exposed to the internet, together with the rest of the world knowing it, right? These vulnerabilities are known as 0 days, where there is no patch or you cannot go and fix it without vendor or the product owner releasing the patch. So coming back to the information leakage and how this information can be useful for an attacker, consider that this 0 day vulnerability out there leads to a complete compromise of a system, right? So when you consider an attacker's point of view and his incentives to launch an attack, an attacker is compromising this server to use his computational resources, right? For maybe to run a botnet infrastructure or to run crypto mining, etc. Like he can use it once he compromise a box. He can use it for anything, right? So usually when 0 days are released, what usually the hackers do is search over the entire internet to find servers which are running that particular version. In our case, it's an Apache 2.2, right? Um, and usually this information is obtained by just looking at the HTTP response header. So basically, attacker just needs to write a script which queries and check the HTTP response to understand if the server is running on Apache 2.2, right? And once he identify that it is running Apache 2.2 and there is no uh, no patch for it, and he's sure that it could be exploited, right? And he can launch the exploit and um, take over the box. So this attack would not have happened if the development team or the developer who developed the application have removed the server banner or the server information from server version details from the HTTP response, right? So it's very important that you when you have build an application, you remove all those version details or the library information, version debugging information, all those from the application, so that in case of 0 days, your application will be still exploitable, but attackers will not be able to identify our internet. um, Git code exposure. So this is very interesting because um, from an attacker's perspective, usually what happens is that we have seen developers putting code in GitHub, right? So that they can reuse the code, right? But what they do unknowingly is that when they upload the scripts, they put in the service account details as part of the code, or API token information as part of the code, right? It's not just Git, but even in Stack Overflow also we see this happening, right? Where people pasting codes to ask a doubt, and this becomes a good place for attackers to go and identify the code and understand the working of an application. Debugging information. This is also very common nowadays, where um, you enable debugging in your application once it goes to the production as well, and it gives out detailed error messages, tag trace information, and also the a lot of times the info pages will disclose more information than it is required to uh, uh, publish, right? So it is very important that you disable this in your pre-production environments, your QA, UAT environments, as well as in your production, right? Because a lot of times QA or UAT environments are replicated to the production environments, and sometimes people do not change the use the same databases for connecting the production environment. The other one that I wanted to bring and talk about is storage service exposure. This is also very common nowadays, as a lot of applications are going to the cloud and proper access controls are not placed in the cloud infrastructure. So now a lot of applications use these AWS S3 buckets as well as Azure's blob storage for storing resources that are required by an application, right? Since the access controls are not properly configured, it becomes very easy for attackers to get hold of these resources, which can aid them to plan their attacks. Darking um, is one another way attackers can find useful information about an application. So if you're not familiar with darking, it is nothing but advanced search using search engines like Google, right? So most of the times, if you do not properly tell the search engine crawlers that you need to just crawl certain pages in your application, and if your applications are not properly configured to protect your directories, what happens is that these crawlers or search engines crawl throughout your application and index them. So when they will also index all the configuration files and everything, right? So what basically happens is that you put in these advanced search queries using certain attributes or search parameters that are offered by search engines, and you will be able to get useful information about applications, right? So I have placed a link in the blue box down, uh, which is a docking DB where people have uploaded a lot of interesting search queries that can be used to dig valuable information out from an application. So moving to the preventive measures, training and awareness the key, right? It is very difficult to mitigate issues that arise due to human factors. Only way we can deal with it is to have proper training and awareness among developers as well as individuals who use the application. So remove version information we discuss as much as possible. I know it will not be completely possible because there are always ways to understand what kind of technology and application is using. But the only thing is that we can put our best foot forward and remove all the mm, version details that we can scrub it off from the application. Again, disable debugging in all the environments, whether it's QA or production. Uh, Also make sure that you properly configure your robot.txt file so that only those pages which are needed to be crawled are indexed in search engines, right? Um, so few things about the current trend. It might not be direct related to information leakage, but I wanted to bring it up on this discussion so that you are aware. I see that a lot of companies are adopting a cloud first strategy now, and it is important for the students to be familiar about the cloud infrastructure, right? A lot of cloud providers are giving free subscriptions to students, so please ask your students to take advantage of those. And so when I was studying, it was difficult for me to actually configure a lab which has multiple VNets, subnets, and place a firewall rule and configure the Active Directory environment because those needed hardware requirements back then. Now, in the cloud, all these things are a click away, and you do not need to purchase any hardware to configure and learn about these fundamental components within a network. So please encourage your students to be familiar with the cloud platform. And I also believe that going forward, a lot of traditional jobs like networking, perimeter security, network monitoring, the conventional data center operation, all these are going to get automated and will be moving to the cloud infrastructure. And so it's very important now students to be prepared for these new job openings that are related to cloud. Okay, so that being said, moving to the next slide, passwords. So there are three attack vectors that are mentioned here. They are almost the same, but different variation of brute forcing, the first one, right? So those who are not familiar with the term brute forcing, it means you try to identify application accounts by trying all combinations of alphabets, numerals, and symbols. Uh, so normally brute forcing takes a lot of time to complete, right? Because you need to complete the entire combinations. So attackers came with the second type, which is called as the dictionary attack. So in this specific case of dictionary attacks, attackers will be using specific targeted password lists that are commonly used, right? So there was an interesting research in 2015 where a lot of password people created to protect their accounts were related to Star Wars, the same year Episode 7 released, right? So if you're an attacker in back 2015, you just need to create a good directory list of Star Wars character names and give it to your brute forcing tool to get an account hacked, and there is high chance that you will be able to compromise few attacks. um, There are specific tools now that are able to look into your online profiles and curate dictionary of passwords that you might be using in your to protect your account. So if you have put in your date of birth as a password and your date of birth is public in your online profile, there is high chance that if you are targeted by an attacker, your account can get compromised, right? So it's very important that you use good passwords to protect your accounts. Password spraying. So the first two are rarely exploitable nowadays because of the fact that there are account lockout policies in place, right? um, which will lock your account if somebody tries to brute force it. Say, for example, you try 5 invalid password, it gets locked, right? So the first two is not. I mean, if somebody is putting proper controls in place, first two is not possible. So now what the attackers came with is a new technique called password spraying. Um, which might only work in application which have huge user base but an effective one, right? In this case, what an attacker do is they identify all the username registered within an application, right, and try out only one or two commonly used password depending upon how the password policy is set on that application. So the idea here is that there will be someone who might be using his password, say password 123, which is very common and people use all the time, right? um, Preventing measures, as I mentioned, good password policy is key here, right? It is very important to configure this into your application so that people using your application will not be able to register put in weak passwords. So when I say password policy, it's about account lockout, length and complexity of your password, um, history of passwords, storing history of password, so that you cannot use your last 5 use password and all those things, right? And it is always good that you have two different policies set for normal user accounts as well as privileged user accounts in your application. When I say privileged user account, it means administrative right users, right? um, there are there are tools also in the market that can help you, like privilege access management tools. This is more for administrative accounts. So there are vendor products in the market that gives a lot of protection to these privilege attack accounts and how you manage these accounts. So the idea here is that you don't need a human to actually remember an admin password that can have an inherent risk, right? So there might be disgruntled employees, there might be people leaving organization, um, and you will not be able to log into an admin account that your application is configured to. So you can use the APIs provided by these tools within your application to configure and manage privilege accounts. It can be an expensive solution, but worth for a high critical system where you have very high confidential data. And always follow good password delivery practices. It is always good that the passwords are not sent through an email. Even within your in your day-to-day job also, this can be a good practice that in case you wanted to send an username and password to someone, make sure that you do not send it in a single email. Send it in two different emails so that if one get compromised, um, your account is still protected. And always use registration links um, to register a user into the application, right? So if somebody wants to set their password or reset the password, send a link rather than sending they configuring it and you configuring it and sending through an email. Your application configuring it and sending through an email. Um, One of the other things that protects the password is password always needs to be hashed and stored in the database, right? It should not be encrypted while storing. Um, so you might be already knowing that hashing is a one-way function, making it difficult to recover the original password, right? So, for example, if an administrator um, gets disgruntled with your organization, he decides to copy the pass user accounts. Even if he copies it, he will not be able to use it because he will not be able to recover the original password, right? So hashing, using hashing itself is not secure. You should also use hash with salt. So you should use salted hashes, right? So the protection it gives is that there are these rainbow tables out there where people have already cracked all the hashes and published it online so that each hash has a corresponding decrypted the original text associated with it, right? So when you add a salt to it, it becomes very difficult to create the rainbow tables because the hashes change because you are adding a random string to the hash and it will be a totally different uh, value, right? Um, and one of the common mistakes I see a lot of candidates making during job interviews is that they always say that passwords are encrypted in the and stored in the database, user account passwords, right? So I just want to bring that into your attention so that this is well understood. I also wanted to talk about this is not related to passwords. Um, so OWASP, if you look in the blue box, I have put in a link to OWASP. So OWASP stands for Open Source Web Application Security Project. It is a non-profit foundation that is focused on improving application security, right? So you can go in their portal and get a lot of free resources to learn about application security. You can also get get testing guides how to perform these attack vectors that I am explaining. So please visit there, and I also encourage your students who are interested in application security to visit this website and get useful information from there. Moving on to the next attack vector, uh, authentication and authorization, right? One second. Okay. Um, Authentication and authorization. So these are two different topics, but with the interest of time, I have combined it, and so that I can talk about the major ones, major attack vectors and preventive measures. Right. So default accounts, it is more applicable if you are using one of those out-of-the-shelf products, such as content management solutions like Drupal, um, um, Joomla, all those kind of out of the box systems, WordPress, right? And you customize it for your specific needs. So most of these products come with default admin accounts, which never get changed while going to the production deployment, right? Like I know for sure you might have never changed your Wi-Fi administrative account password, right? You still use admin to log in. It's the same case out here. Now The attacker just needs to go through the operational manual of these products and get the default password, and it's very easy for them to log in as an administrator, right? So please be mindful of that you change default passwords. Mm, the next one is the flaw in authorization flow, right? I'm sure you might have heard in Mohesh Mohan's talk a few days back about how he was able to tamper with the authorization flow to gain access to resources that he should not have access to, basically all those digital documents. Um, so, as an attacker, what he tries to do is he tried to understand how the application um, logic works, right, and try to exploit them, right. So he's finding logical errors and trying to bypass that logical and make use of those logical errors to gain access to areas in the application where he is not authorized to. So most of the times I'm able to bypass the authorization controls is through parameter tampering or adding hidden parameters to a request which is only visible to a privileged user. So um, for example, there is two level of users, right, and there is a specific parameter that is sent as request as part of the request of a privileged account user. So a lot of times developers will think that okay, this parameters is only sent through privilege accounts, so a normal users will not be able to identify this parameter and add that as part of his request, right? So it's it's what we call that security through obscurity, right? So it's not a good practice. So when it's very important that you place controls that the low privilege user is not able to tamper with any of the parameters that is sent as part of his request. Excessive rights to accounts. We all do this, right? Chmod 777 in Linux, right? So that we do not run into errors and everything goes smooth, right? But in fact, you will not need all the permissions to all the user types, right? But you still do chmod 777. It is same here too. You need to give users just the access right he needs in an application, so that even if something get compromised, the malicious actor who gain access to your system have limited privilege in your application, and he will not be able to do much of a damage, right? The next common issue or attack vector that we see is improper implementation of multi-factor authentication, right? A lot of times multi-factor authentication implementations are deeply flawed. Okay, this is due to the fact that a lot of times multi-factor authentications or MFAs are not properly understood. When you implement multi-factor authentication, each factor should ask for different attributes of a user. For example, what I mean is, so for example, first factor can be what an user knows, right? Like a PIN or a password, right? The next factor should be what uh, he has, like a biometric or a phone number that he only has access to. Hence, it becomes very difficult for an attacker to compromise different factors which are at different levels, right? Um, so, preventing measures. Uh, Moving to the next preventing measure, and also, as I mentioned, follow least privilege policy. Look at each user types and make clear tables of what user requirements, what is a user's requirement, and only provide the required rights in the application. Okay. The next preventive measure is an expensive one, but it worth. It's called adaptive authentication, and there are a lot of products out there in the market which provides this um, ability. So what these products do is they analyze user behavior and login activities using AIs and ML models to flag suspicious authentication and authorization activities. So, for example, one case scenario will be this tool see that there is a logging coming from India, and 2 minutes later there is a logging coming from US, right? There is no way that the user can reach US within 2 minutes, right? So these kind of anomalies could be identified and flagged to protect your application, but it can be expensive. So um, next domain is session management. A brief about session for those who are not familiar. After you log into an application using your username and password, the application server creates a session for you. And your session information is associated with a session identifier or a cookie that the application server issues, right? And as you already know that HTTP is a stateless protocol, right? What it means that a user's existence is only known by the server when it receives the cookie within the request, right? Which means that your cookie or the session identifier that is issued by your application server is your identity now. So that explains why you should protect these session identifiers and cookies, right? So some of the attack vectors against it are session guessing, session fixation, session hijacking, and CSRF attack, right? So session fixation, this is an attack vector which was exploited very commonly some time back. Now there are a lot of good libraries out there which prevent this, but these happens when a developer decide to write something from the scratch, right? So there are multiple ways how session fixation could be achieved. So essentially what an attacker is trying to do is he's going to set a session identifier, a cookie or a token that he already knows for a victim's login session, right? And now since your access rights are associated with this particular token, and due to the fact that attackers know the token that you are using or the cookie that is already enabled for your session, attacker can use the cookie to log in as you and impersonate you. All right. Um, Session hijacking. There are multiple ways how you can perform session hijacking, right? Either through eavesdropping the network and sniffing the traffic in the network and get hold of this. And this will not work if you are using an application over HTTPS, right? Where is a TLS is enabled in your application. So usually session hijackings are performed using cross-site scripting attacks, which we'll talk in a moment in the next slides. So essentially they are trying to get hold of these cookies that is stored in your browser so that they can log in as you into that application. Next attack vector is CSRF. Um, This attack vector was on top of the chart for long time, and there are few applications still being exploited where proper controls are not placed. So CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery, right? So this is an attack that allows an attacker to force a user to perform actions that they do not intend to perform, right? So this can be achieved by sending and victim crafted links or make him visit attackers hosted website that are designed to make queries to target certain website. So the only precondition here is that the victim needs to be authenticated to the target website. So for example, you are logged into your banking website, right? And you have this banking website open in one of your browsers tabs, and you have opened another tab and you are browsing through a attacker's website that he has hosted. The attacker's website will be making requests to the bank domain without you knowing, and maybe transfer a payment account or make a transaction with transfer a payment, right? So this is not possible because as of now, because a lot of the big and well developed application make use of CSRF token that we'll talk about in the preventive measures. So as mentioned, in the preventive measure, the session IDs should be long enough, right? And have good entropy. When I say entropy, it has a disordered randomness so that it is not predictable by an attacker, right? So like the password, it's not able, you are not able to brute force the um, cookie value, and if it have enough length, it will take ages for an attacker to compromise. And there are certain attributes that you can configure in your application, like cookie attributes that you can configure in your application, such as HTTP only, secure flag domains, which aids good protection for cookies, right? So I'll not be going through in detail in the interest of time, but it's very important that these attributes are configured in your application to protect the cookies or tokens. CSRF token, which is the preventive measure for against CSRF attack. Um, so what CSRF token essentially does is, whenever there is a submit request made by a user to an app, to the application, this adds a random CSRF token as part of your submit query, right? Which is issued by your application server. So in the case of the banking portal that we were talking, even if when you visit an attacker's website, and in the backend, if there is a query that happened to the bank domain, the attacker will not be able to get hold of this CSRF token that the server has issued to your banking open session, right? In that way, you can protect your application from CSRF attack. So smaller lifetime of session identifiers is very important. This will protect in multiple ways. So for example, your session is valid only for 30 minutes. After that, you need to log into your application and create a new session token, right? So it helps in the case of in case of when an attacker is trying to brute force and get a string, because in 30 minutes you'll not be able to brute force all the combinations of a lengthy session identifier, right? And also it helps in protecting those unattended sessions, right, where somebody decides to log into the application and leave, so it automatically expires you. So in the blue box, I have put in certain vulnerable projects, right? So these are vulnerable web projects where you can install this application in your virtual machine or wherever you want, and try attacking it to learn about these attack vectors, right? So please share it with your students who are interested to learn about these attack vectors and get into security, get into network and application security, right? And also there are two links that I have put in where um, these are resources where you can go and learn about network penetration testing as well. Cool.
So
So
there is a chat.
mhm.
Excuse me, sir. There is a question in the chat box regarding what is CSRF actually.
Okay, so CSRF is cross-site request forgery. So consider that you are as I mentioned, consider that you are browsing a banking website, right? And there are a lot of requests that will be sent when you do a transaction in that website. Okay, so basically it can be a get request or a post request where you submit a form, right? So you are already logged into this session, right? And now you have opened another tab where you are going through some other application. Say, for example, a vulnerable application which is hosted by an attacker, right? And what he have done is he has written a lot of scripts in that application, right, which make requests to your banking domain, right? So if there is no protection or your banking website do not have these um, CSRF tokens implemented, what happens is that the attacker's website can send a request to the banking domain which make a transaction call, maybe an account transfer, right? Because the fact that you are already logged into the application to your banking website, right? So what CSRF do is it is actually exploiting the trust that your application is having on your browser, right? So if there is no CSRF protection that is implemented, the server has no way that to identify who is making the request. As I mentioned, HTTP is a stateless protocol, right? Only way it can identify is using your session token, which will be appended when the attacker's website send the request to perform that transaction, right? So hope it makes sense, right? So it's the precondition always is that you need to be logged into a genuine session of any website that you're visiting, and at the meantime you are uh, going through a vulnerable website. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Um, Moving on to some of the meaty attack vectors. So input validation. So all these attack vectors arise due to improper input validation, right? So these are the most critical attack vectors, and all these are severely rated, right? I'll not be going through all these in more detail in interest of time, but I would like to highlight the first two, which are very prevalent nowadays. That is NoSQL injection as well as XXE, that is XML entity external entity attacks, right? So a lot of applications now use NoSQL database bases, which are such as these MongoDB, Cassandra, which are non-tabular databases and does not use those classical relationship database models. Um, though these NoSQL databases do not support SQL statements, they still allow users to query for information in the backend. Um, so there are no standard ways, or it all depends upon how these databases are implemented. So only thing is that the attackers need to guess how the implementation logic is developed, and he can inject the queries in the non-SQL format and get useful information out of your application. All right. The other common thing that we usually see now is XML entity attack. Right. This is also very common attack um, that the attackers make use of to get valuable information out of the system. Uh, so This is an attack performed by interfering with the application processing of XML data, right? So, which means that if some of the features of the application's XML parsers are not disabled, an attacker can view files in your application server, or um, he he can, in certain cases, he can leverage the information that he already obtained to obtained about the configuration files in your application to compromise the entire server. So this is very important attack vector nowadays. And even in the last week, we identified a, not we, there was a disclosure uh, for SharePoint which exploits this XSE attack, right? Which was rated very high. Um, Moving to injection, SQL injection. This is very popular and a lot of people know about this, right? And this is the same with the NoSQL, but it is attack against the traditional relationship database models, right? So you craft, as part of your user input, you put in um, SQL queries and send it to the application server, and it gets executed and fetches data from your SQL database. Command injection, this is also very common, but it's not very popular now, where you are able to execute operating system commands that you push through an input parameter and get it executed in the operating system context, right? Cross-site scripting, this is also very common, and this is more of a client-side attack, which means that as an attacker, his objective is to get a client-side script like JavaScript executed in your browser, right? And doing so, he will be able to get hold of the victim session IDs and make him, and you will be able to impersonate him or make him redirect to a different phishing site, and the possibilities are lot over there. So preventing measures is the most important preventing measures for input validation is never trust any user inputs, right? And use those sanitization libraries provided by different frameworks out there, right? Don't try. It's always important that you do not try to build anything from the scratch, because it will prone to a lot of errors, right? So use well audited, well reviewed libraries out there, so that your application is protected. uh, and it's also very difficult for it from a tester's perspective to identify these input parameter issues, because there will be thousands of parameters out there in an application, right? So the best way that we can identify these sort of vulnerabilities is through code review, right? um, to prevent SQL injection, prepared statement, you must be very familiar, which are precompiled queries, which only accept definite values to it, and it will not run in a new context of SQL, right? So make use of prepared statements to protect your application against SQL injection. To prevent XSE attacks, the best way is to disable features in your XML parser which resolve to external entities, such as a directory path, right? And if you want those resolution really needed in your application, make sure that you create a whitelist where it tells the parser that you can only go to these directories in an application and fetch resources from there. So in the interest of time, I'll be moving to the next slide, which is very important. That is supply chain issues, right? So this is very common now, as a lot of applications are moving to cloud infrastructure, and nobody wants to maintain the entire infrastructure of the application, right? So supply chain issues arise when your application is in the production for a long time and no active monitoring of the application happens. So you have forgotten about the application or you do not have enough support for the application. Now, a lot of application uses resources from third-party application which might not be controlled by you, right? So, from an attacker's perspective, now what you can do is you do not need to attack uh, the application that you are protecting because it has good security controls around it, but he can just go to the he can go and compromise this third party application from where the resources are being fetched, right? Which have weak security controls in place. Now, since the third party application is able to compromise, right? Then attacker can tamper with the resources that it hosts, right? Um, for example, if your application is taking a JavaScript from this third-party site, an attacker, while compromising, he can modify that JavaScript and put in a malicious script that can redirect you or um, harvest the credentials or do anything that he wants. And that is what is mean by supply chain attack, right? And this exactly happened with the mage card attack, which is very popular now, which is still going on and cause huge revenue loss for organization companies like British Airways, Ticketmaster, Magento. And in case of British Airways, this particular issue led to the theft of payment data of around 4 lakh customers, right? And they had to pay huge fine, and the case is still going on. um, Orphan CMM takeover. This is also very prevalent nowadays due to application going to the cloud infrastructure. So what happens here is that so this can be a little bit confusing. Just hear me out and see if you follow. So when you create a resource in Azure, um, your cloud infrastructure, say a website, so Azure allows you to create an endpoint which is basically a URL, say fisat.azure.com, right? So um, you decide that you need to host the Fisat homepage in a cloud infrastructure, and you go and when you create the resource web application in Azure, it allows you to take a name, right? In this case, Fisat, right? And it appends their domain, that is azurewebsite.com. So now you cannot actually share fisat.azurewebsite.com to your end customer because they will not trust it, because you need your homepage to be hosted on fisat.com, right? So what you basically people do is you create a CNAME, a DNS record pointing fisat.azurewebsite.com to fisat.com, right? um, Now as time goes on and you decide that you do not need fisat.azurewebsite.com resource that you created in Azure, um, and you decide to switch it off, and if you do not remove the DNS CNAME entry that you made in your DNS, what attackers can do is, since the fisat.com is in the Fisat name is in the free pool in Azure, he can go in and register fisat.azurewebsite.com in Azure. And since your DNS is pointing fisat.com to the CNAME entry of fisat.azurewebsite.com, right, which is now in the hands of an attacker, he can host a phishing page over there, right? And he can always credential and use it in whatever way he wants. So it's very important that you monitor all these third-party components that you are using in your application and get it audited frequently, right? And that brings us to the end of this presentation, and I will take any questions you might be having. Let me quickly go to the chat. Okay, I think we cleared the question related to cross-site request forgery, CSRF. Any questions, any comments, anyone? Okay, there is a question in the chat box which says about content delivery networks, right? CDNs, right? So CDNs are, I'm not quite familiar with it, but there are certain attack vectors that related to CDN, content network networks. So essentially, CDNs are ways where you can have a load balancing or um, deliver your pages, web application pages based upon different locations, right? So there was some attack vectors related to CDN caching in the past, where um, it's called, the attack vector is called um, HTTP response splitting, right? HTTP response splitting. You can Google it. HTTP response splitting. So what it essentially do is it enables attackers to create a page and cache it in the CDN, right? So essentially, when somebody, so CDN is essentially a cache between your application server and your CDN hosting provider, right? So basically, what happens is that a lot of times the pages in the CDN are not frequently refreshed, right? So there was a attack vector in Cloudflare where one of the CDNs that a lot of applications use, where attacker is able to exploit the cache and put in the a page that he's created, right? So basically, when you request for a page, rather than going and fetching from the backend, it fetches you this cached page that the attacker has created, right? And he can do whatever he wants, right? He can use it for phishing campaigns and anything. And there are a few other vectors as well for CDN, and it's a good place. If your application is using CDN, you need to review how it using, what is a caching policy, all those things. Okay, any further questions?
Hope we have no questions more, and we can end up with the session. So thank you,
Yeah.
sir. It was
So
a very
please reach out to me if you have further questions or like to learn more about it, right? Please reach out to me. And also, uh, one of the things that is lacking now is we are not getting good resources who knows about these attack vectors, right? For hiring, and a lot of times people are not introduced to this, and there are huge job openings in application security as of now, and there is a huge gap that has to be filled, right? So please encourage your students to get involved in these things if they are interested, right? And uh, yeah, I'm always there to associate with you guys to get you updated on new stuff that are happening. So thank you everyone for listening patiently, and I hope there is some takeaway for you. Thank you.
thank you, sir. It was a very resourceful session and a need for the time since we are all doing a lot of financial transactions online nowadays. And I hope we all have gained a good understanding on the various attack vectors against web applications and the security measures and the preventive measures that you can take in order to tackle with all those attacks. Thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable knowledge and time with us. Thank you. We'll break
No
for lunch
problem.
now and we'll be joining back by 2 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.